Director for International Economics on NSC and the National Economics Council, and is an intelligence officer in the US Naval Reserve. Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt is the Senior Managing Director of the Energy and Critical Minerals Practice at McLarty Associates, and a Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. He's held a variety of senior leadership positions during a distinguished 35-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Energy and Resources, served as ambassador to Greece in 2016 to 2022 when China acquired the port of Piraeus, as well as being an ambassador to Ukraine. Lastly, not least, my two brilliant colleagues and co-authors on this report, Thome and Rory Fedorochko. Leah holds a bachelor's degree in political science and international relations with a minor in Chinese language and a master's degree in global affairs from Schwarzman College. Leah was the Schwarzman Fellow at the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute of China in the United States. Rory has a BA in history and IR from Mary, and he focuses at AidData on researching high-income countries. Very briefly, on our report and data set, for those of you who had a chance to see it, we've constructed a massive data set tracking all Chinese commitments and investments in Chinese overseas global seaports, a portfolio worth nearly $24 billion for 168 ports in 90 countries. If you go to our data set, there's 129 variables for each port record, and there will shortly be an interactive dashboard to accompany that data set. In our research, we document a variety of financial instruments and intentions used by Chinese official agencies and SOEs, as well as benefits. So we look at how China is able to secure export markets, key and critical resources that are increasingly important, financial returns for investments in ports in high-income countries, as well as being able to acquire influence, intelligence, communications, and data. One of our findings in our report is that China has enormous advantage in being able to offer end-to-end financing of port services. So this includes financing for the port, construction, the equipment that is in the port, such as these very large ship-to-shore cranes, becoming a port operator, logistics platforms, software, shipping lines that connect to global networks, etc. I think for most of the world's powers, and we'll get into this a little bit, including China, the US, and the EU, we're at an intersection right now of economic, statecraft, domestic industrial policies, and national security, more closely intertwined now than they have been perhaps since World War II. But China, we find, already has a head start in this area. So I'll start by asking a few questions of each of our panelists, and then we'll eventually turn it over to the audience Q&A. So my first question is for my co-author, Leah Thome. Our report finds that Chinese seaport financing is increasingly centered around commodities vital for China's economic and national security. Can you tell us more about how this shift has occurred, or how this commodity-centered financing for seaports is taking place?
Perfect, thank you. All right, let's see how this works. You guys hear me? All right, here we go. Sorry about that. Happy we're figuring this out at the beginning and not the end. Yes, certainly. So in this report, we actually looked specifically at commodities, and we kind of looked at 5 different areas of commodities. We looked at food security, such as soybean exports, for example. We looked at military security, too, as we've seen China establish on overseas space in Djibouti. We looked also at critical minerals. That was actually a very special focus that we took in this report, centered around global supply chains and choke points. Our data set is openly accessible, and something very unique that Rory and I designed for this data set is that we actually have a variable that captures the kind of port infrastructure that China is building. The most commonly financed infrastructure that is being built at port facilities was actually focused on energy and critical mineral infrastructure. So for example, LNG export terminals, coal export terminals. I do believe we have one of the biggest coal export terminal in Australia, for example. We have an LNG terminal. Also in Australia, actually at the same site as that coal export terminal in Australia, which is pretty cool, seeing that proximity to each other. But also something very interesting that we did is we actually worked with another data set that we published in January on Chinese financing for transition minerals, and we looked, is there any overlap between Chinese finance mines and Chinese finance seaports? And we did find that there was an overlap. So going the European way with the kilometers instead of the miles, is that we found basically 7 mines within 250 kilometers of these Chinese finance seaports. Most of them were centered actually in Latin America, specifically around the port of Chancay. And then we also looked at 500 kilometers, and there were 12 further mines that we found within those 500 kilometers for a total of 19 Chinese finance mines within the seaports. So something that we actually talked about in length in the report is this new model that we're seeing to emerge, that perhaps ports have shifted away from over-militarization to really focusing on building these hubs of connectivity that facilitate the export of these commodities. We actually call it the port railway mine model, that we actually further dissect in 2 case studies. First of all, with the port of Chancay, we're seeing a land corridor being built between Peru and Brazil to critical ports, to mines, that then are exported, or soybeans that are being exported from Brazil now to Chancay to get that to China. And then we also look at the port of Morbaya in Guinea, where China's also financed the construction of the Simandou iron mine. So it's really interesting, and I really encourage reading into these case studies further, but I'll leave it here for now.
Thanks, Leah. And so following on from that, and the next question is going to ask you, Pyatt, since you have this tremendous expertise in critical minerals, it seems like the way the discussion is happening in policy and media circles is that critical minerals, access to them is a zero-sum game. And that's where great power competition is increasingly being focused. From your point of view, what should the US strategy be to be able to access critical minerals and energy sources? Should we go it alone? Should it be alliances?
So maybe just 3 very quick points on this. First of all, it's a good thing that the Trump administration has supercharged a lot of the US government's efforts in this area. Project Forge, which is basically the State Department's repackaging of our mineral security partnership. The Vault initiative out of the Export-Import Bank, the largest line item that EXIM has ever deployed in its history. Systematic focus from DFC on projects involving this sector. I think 2 principles, and I would also note that in the Trump administration, having come in initially with what I would call a sort of pure MAGA approach, very focused on doing things as the United States and here domestically, that has clearly evolved now to a much greater focus on the international partnerships that we need to be successful in this area, and the summit meeting, the ministerial that Secretary Rubio hosted a couple of weeks at the State Department encapsulates that. I'd also underline the importance of what Leah highlighted, which is the nexus between infrastructure investment and critical minerals. The Biden administration tried to do this with the Libido Corridor and the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. The Trump administration has quietly continued that same work. My successor, Kayla Moore, the Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs, has a team continuing to work on these issues. So that's all good. And I think I want to maybe turn back later to some of the takeaways from my experience with Greece and the Chinese investment there. But what I would highlight is, in a world of finite resources, we are starting very, very far back on the curve in terms of clawing back some of China's market dominance. It's clearly going to take decades of concerted effort across Republican and Democratic administrations to rectify that situation, and we're going to be much more successful to the extent we can work with international allies and partners. And that, of course, requires that we preserve and cultivate the coin of the realm in the diplomatic world that I occupied for 35 years, which is trust and confidence.
Thank you, Professor. And next question for Paul. Paul, you've done a lot of research in this area as well. Can you tell us whether China's strategy in Africa to reach key commodities, critical minerals, including reaching to landlocked countries within the interior, how that might be evolving currently?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I have tremendous respect for AidData, and I use it almost every day in my work. By the way, you should know that the Chinese also use your data. They might not acknowledge. They might not have acknowledged. They might not acknowledge it, but they use your data, and I think that's an indication of the quality of the data and some of the problems that the Chinese state agencies have in collecting and documenting data. So, congratulations. Look, I think that looking at what Chinese state-owned firms are doing in the African poor states is very much part of a global logic, in the sense that across world regions, whether we're looking at South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as we do in my organization, and Africa, we find certain commonalities, right? These are the same tools, the same instruments the Chinese are deploying. These are the same state-owned enterprises, the same CEOs, operating in the same sectors, but that engagement looks different across regions, right? So if you look at, for instance, in Latin America, countries that are very serious about enforcing things like tendering, laws around quality control and stuff, the Chinese state-owned enterprises will respect that. But when you look at the African continent, the very same companies are going to operate very differently. So that speaks to the importance of agency on the parts of local governments. In terms of whether these investments could be turned into dual-use facilities, I think there's multiple schools of thought involved in this. Djibouti so far has been the only example of a commercial port that was upgraded to serve military purposes. So in scholarship, when you have only one precedent, it becomes very difficult, to kind of look into the future and positively speculate as to where the next facility will be. But I think there are other indicators as well. So I keep, referring anecdotally to some conversations that one has had with African port authorities and African governments. And there's one in particular that comes to mind, which is a country that trains heavily with the PLA, with the People's Liberation Army, a country that is influential in its on the African continent, because that's also very important for the Chinese to avoid pushback. And the feedback from this particular official was, with all these Chinese-built military and port facilities in the country, perhaps the Chinese may not necessarily need a military base in the way that we think of a military base. Perhaps what they might need is access, because these systems have been built by the Chinese and were built over a long period of time. Yes, they were built over a long period of time. So the Chinese know the country, they know the facilities, they know the area, they have the level of political trust. And the country has a level of stability that the Chinese would be looking for. Therefore, in that particular case, it would not be beyond the realm of possibility that the Chinese would have sort of like a memorandum of understanding with this particular country to say, hey, we need this facility for the next 6 months to do contingency A, contingency B, contingency C. So when it comes to indicators as to whether these facilities may be converted for dual use, I think we need to broaden the aperture. And we need to think about basing differently. Because the Chinese have a completely different approach to basing, completely different doctrine. And I think it would help to look at things from a Chinese perspective and to then begin to see the different configurations that the Chinese civilian and military agencies and security agencies would use to be able to give them the access they need along these various port clusters, which tend to be concentrated at the moment in West Africa.
Thank you. For William, if you were advising the US government in its totality on how best to compete with China, specifically on overseas port infrastructure, port equipment, etc., what would be some of the do's and don'ts you think about, bearing in mind, obviously, we have ports here in the US and also need refurbishing overhaul?
Yeah, certainly. I think the point I'll make is about every time I read an AidData report, I'm reminded, and it's illustrated to me, the financial flexibility of the Chinese state and state-line entities, and placed into our contracts with the lack of financial flexibility of U.S. international-facing institutions, particularly to compete in the realm of economics and technology. We have the DFC, we have Exim Bank. These are small, basically cottage agencies by comparison to the capabilities that the Chinese state has to deploy to advance its objectives around the world. And I think there's, it's an interesting point about the Chinese using AidData's research to understand the impact of their own work. It's a kind of a funny comment, probably a reality, but it's a reminder that quantity has a quality all its own, particularly in the context of foreign investment. In the context of foreign investment reports, the well-executed investment by the Chinese around the last 10 to 15 years. If I was advising the US government, I think AidData supported lots of work that I was part of in government around the creation of a US strategic investment fund, around expanding the flexibilities of DFC to invest in a wider array of deal types, structures, and countries, and also to advocate for scale for the sake of scale. So more appropriations focused on investment abroad in order to advance the position of the United States in competitive markets. Because I think I'll steal a quote from an old boss of mine who said that competition between nuclear powers, the battlefield is in the fields of economics and technology, not necessarily in the realm of the military. The next marginal dollar of U.S. spending internationally shouldn't be in the Department of Defense or all these days. It should probably be in the field of economic statecraft and in institutions like the DFC or whatever other successor institutions that we create. So that's the advice I would give. In terms of domestic versus international, one of the great challenges in the American government is we have this artificial bifurcation between domestic and foreign spending and activity. The infrastructure law in the United States in 2021 invested $21 billion in U.S. port infrastructure. It's the largest investment in the last 50 years in U.S. ports. I think that there's probably an equivalent package that you could do focused on international maritime trade, because the core crux of the matter is that much the way our sanctions regime is, it allows the U.S. government the ability to control the movement of dollar around the world. You now can no longer move a piece of cargo around the world that's not on a Chinese financed asset, whether it's a port, a ship, a crane, whatever it might be. So that's sort of the way I look at the world, for the interesting question.
Thank you.
Howard, can I add something to that? Sure. We also in our last chapter of the report actually also give a little bit of advice and policy recommendations, and something that we look at as towards having a comprehensive and holistic port strategy. And actually, I am from Germany, and our partners, my company got a little ahead of the U.S. government here, and actually just last week released a European port strategy that I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit more once we get to Greece and other European port investments. But I think that is really a step forward. We've also seen the Maritime Action Plan in recent weeks, and I think that also really shows that the U.S. government is really focused on the maritime sphere, but again, often shipbuilding, shipping, and port investments were seen as insular or separate when they in fact need to be viewed together. I think that is perhaps a step forward. And some other policy recommendations, advice that we actually give based on our data, is looking at, first of all, creating a port shopper tool where we partner with third partner countries and help them decide on bids, we compare bids, seek out partners, public-private partnerships. And then also something that we actually recommend is building a task force that really brings together a whole society, whole of government approach to understanding ports, because often there's different methodologies. You look at official sector financing, you look at port stakes, do you look at involvement broadly, do you look only at the military, economic, and so bringing all these approaches and methodologies together, not only from the academic or scholarly view, but also from the government, from the private sector, I think that would be a good way forward to find a unified approach and think holistically about these issues and challenges.
AidData, to assemble our data set, we tracked more than 1,100 official agencies and SOEs that provide financing for Chinese official projects, with almost as many types of financing. So I'll ask Rory next to lift the hood a little bit and maybe explain to us how a loan for Melbourne, Australia, for example, might be different from financing to Shanghai, Peru.
Great, thank you, Alex. And it's my first ever panel, so it's really cool to have this distinguished group alongside me. So, under the hood, there's a little smoke, we can breathe and see it. So the Port of Melbourne, Victoria, one of Australia's largest container ports. And the Chinese finance at the Port of Melbourne is a little interesting. Because there's different activities, the same thing. And obviously, ports are big pieces of infrastructure, and you have different berths, you have different operators. So in Melbourne, in 2016, the Victorian state government privatized this, and part of the privatization consortium, mostly sovereign wealth funds, including China Sovereign Wealth Fund, the China Investment Corporation. They bought a second port, and Chinese state banks backed that financing. And when they did some refinancing for that in 2019, Chinese state banks were on that, also in 2024 as well. So you can see here that the relationships with the banks to the ports in this capacity is just Chinese investor to the ports, and they're going to give lending to the ports to benefit that Chinese investor, minority maybe. And there's also the ports. In 2016, there was a container terminal run by a Philippine terminal operator, and that's a separate Chinese bank was a part of the syndicate for that. So it still has a Chinese operator, but totally different purpose. There's not there. The Chinese purpose is small. Presence is not huge. When we compare that to China, and the port, most importantly, largely already existed. We did some renovations, but this was a mature assets that was being supported. And I go to Zhangsheng, which my colleague Leah is written a lovely blog post about. Zhangsheng was a totally greenfield investment. It was a syndicate of, I think, almost entirely Chinese state-owned banks. And they provide very large loan in hundreds of millions of dollars to support the asset. There's a Chinese operator at the port, Chinese owner of the port that has the concession for this. It was totally new, completely done by the Chinese. So you compare that, Zhangsheng to Melbourne, it kind of encapsulates a range in this portfolio. You have when Chinese financiers are supporting brand new stuff where they have a lot of control. They are, these things have great, important strategic effects per country. Peru didn't have a lot of big ports on that thing. Now it does, and that's a big deal. Whereas in Melbourne, it's mature assets, the Chinese presence is minimal, and the banks are helping out a co-patriot company while also making a nice return on the side. And we capture the full range in between in our data set. And knowing the differences, and you can really delve into what you might think is problematic and what you might think is okay. Maybe you think Zhangsheng is problematic because it's a big Chinese presence, and you think Melbourne is not because it's minimal. And having the data to be able to make evidence-based decision making across that is one thing our C-Course data does, and we're really happy about that. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rick. We had a lot of discussions focused on construction, ownership, operation, ports themselves. In our current data collection and reporting, we're also looking at port equipment, which is obviously sort of crucial in what China is able to offer as basically sort of a turnkey package to a potential purchaser.
This is like absolutely my favorite topic to discuss. I'm so glad we were able to incorporate this in this report. And I'm actually much more curious to hear William's thoughts on this because we just chatted a little bit about this. But actually the way that we incorporate port equipment, and this is the first time we've done this in this data set, and that was actually based on some previous research I've done for AidData where I exclusively looked at scanners. And something that I found in that research was that these scanners, whether they're used for border crossings, airports or seaports, are almost exclusively given through donations. I believe it's high up to 80% and often provided by Nantulya, which is on the US Entity List. So that was kind of the impetus to incorporate that also in our current seaports data set. But we went beyond scanners and also incorporated general equipment. Sometimes we were unable to identify what exact kind of equipment came alongside the port financing as scanners. Scanners have been in the news of recent years here in the United States, especially because of the PMC. Then again, scanners, cranes, and I believe that's actually where we left it off. And something that we found is that often that port equipment financing comes alongside general financing. So for example, as Rory just mentioned, the port of Chongqing, that came together with the construction of the port. There were also ZPMC crates committed as part of that general project record. That is about $4.7 billion that we found in equipment financing alongside this port financing. But when we look at exclusively port equipment projects, we found about $500 million worth of port equipment projects. A really exciting example that we actually added pretty last minute to the data set was a project committed to the port of Montevideo in Uruguay, where we had an electric robot sniffer dog that was given to the port authority there, alongside also not only the provision of equipment, but also the training of Uruguayan officials. So something that we've also seen that oftentimes this equipment is given as part of the donation, but it isn't typically a concessional loan. And not only is it the provision of that equipment, but also the training and maintenance of that equipment. And in the case of the port of Montevideo in Uruguay, what we've actually seen is that China finds that training and flew a few Uruguayan officials to China to conduct that training. And so there's really a treasure trove of information on port equipment that was previously, I believe, discovered or analyzed on that scale. And yeah, I highly encourage everyone to read that chapter, but I'm much more curious, William, now to hear your thoughts working on cybersecurity on ports.
Sure, thanks. I think there are maybe a few journalists here, and I would recommend going and reading Dave's report on new tech. It's one of the least covered, but the most impactful pieces of academic research that the government's consumed in the last 5 years. It's like the results are somewhat stunning as a list on the US side. I think the place that I would start on the port equipment question, and perhaps I'm biased because I worked on this for several years at NSC, is it's really an endemic example of the cutting edge of economic statecraft between where the US is unable to compete, we're competing alongside its allies, and Chinese use overcapacity in the manufacturing sector to deploy ultra-strategic assets throughout the global economic supply chain that creates a sort of quasi-ability to turn off on different choke points. And there's sort of three types of risks that we used to consider in the government associated with port technology. There is collection risk, so do you know what's moving in and out of the port because the system that's in the ship and shore crane or the other type of heavy lift equipment is linked back to a central node. There is classic cybersecurity risk, which is to say there's a backdoor inject and it can be turned off in time of war. But the type of risk that we were most concerned about was core economic security risk. So the ZPMC, which is the large Chinese state enterprise that produces most of the world's heavy lift equipment, particularly these ship-to-shore cranes, which are the cranes that move cargo on and off of large vessels, but they also produce RTGs and a bunch of different other sort of key assets in a port environment. They control 70% market share, and then I think Chinese companies total are moving towards 80% market share of port equipment. And they're able to deploy these assets at below market rates, supported by Chinese state lending into ports that are being set up by a group of Chinese developers. It allows for like a sort of a captured market expansion. There's probably now a half dozen, but there are 3 big ones. And one of the pieces of the president's maritime action plan followed up on a directive in the Executive Order on Maritime Dominance, which directed the State Department, which is both the ambassador's thoughts on, to go out around the world and get the rest of America's allies and partners to tariff Chinese port equipment, to create a protected market for the production of port equipment in Europe and the United States and Latin America. That ultimately was one of that fell down when the Maritime Action Plan came out. Then the Trump administration decided to essentially pause actions of the 3-1 investigation that was started in the Biden administration. So it's sort of this like whipsaw, our whipsaw in terms of trade policy on this topic has hamstrung the ability to create productive capacity for these assets outside of the PRC. And the PRC has been able to use a suite of its tools to be able to proliferate the production of these capabilities, not just in China, but around the world. So it's an under-discussed topic and often over-rotated on the cybersecurity question, but is actually at the cutting edge of economic statecraft. So I'll pause there and say how you wish to learn.
For Ambassador Pyatt, I'd like to sort of draw on 2 of your previous ambassadorial assignments to get your take on Piraeus, Greece, and obviously Ukraine and the potential for privatization of ports there. Specifically, Piraeus has been in the news recently where the ambassador has suggested that perhaps China should give up the port. We do a bit of a deep dive into Piraeus and how unique it is in terms of being operated, controlled really by China, which is unusual for the high-income country ports, especially in Europe. You were there when all this happened. What have you sort of seen from the time you were there when China came in? And it seemed like it was welcome as an investor to some degree when Greece was in sort of economic freefall to the present day and sort of the future potential competitor report that they've heard of the U.S. might invest in somewhere in Greece. And then the Ukraine question and the potential privatization report. Who might bid on that? Might China might be in play?
Thanks, Alex. And as I was thinking about this conversation, one of the things that I think is very telling in terms of how Washington thinks about these issues is that when I was going through confirmation for U.S. Ambassador to Greece, this issue never came up. And it was literally that summer when Costco was finalizing its acquisition of the port of Piraeus. And it's a reminder of how recent this issue is. It was a defining issue for 6 years of my ambassadorship because it became very clear to me after I arrived that China was using its presence in Piraeus, what Xi Jinping called the dragon's head of the Belt and Road Initiative, to really exercise influence across Greek civil society in the context of a NATO ally that was on its back economically. And so our approach when I was in government was to focus first and foremost on trying to create some backfires to ensure that we put a fence around what China's doing. In this regard, I was very grateful for support from Congress, in particular from Senator Murphy, and I was testifying before the SFRC a couple of weeks ago. He reminded everybody about the work that we did together at that time to amend the NDAA to allow the DFC to invest into high-income countries like Greece. It made a critical difference. So we put together what became a $125 million DFC project to invest into a shipyard, which was adjacent to the port of Piraeus and was sort of next on China's hit list. And it turned out to be extremely successful in essentially stopping China's momentum in this sector. The port itself is not going anywhere. I wish Ambassador Geoffrey luck. There's no chance of extricating the Chinese from that facility. And in fact, over the course of my 6 years, the port of Piraeus grew from being ranked somewhere in the 80s in terms of throughput up to in the top 20 ports in the world, which is what happens as COSCO invested in new cranes, automated container handling equipment, and also decided where to unload its big 40,000 TEU international carrier. So it's on its way. Piraeus is on its way to becoming the largest transshipment port in Europe. And I think one of the things that the AidData report usefully highlights is the importance of using tools like the DFC strategically. William alluded to this as well, but $24 billion of infrastructure, the US government can't play at that table. And so figuring out where are the projects which make strategic importance will also move the needle. And I would argue that Piraeus met that criteria because it was in a NATO country. In fact, there's a US military facility embedded inside the Chinese controlled port, which is used to transshipment of materials down to Suda Bay, which is a unique US naval asset on a Greek island, which has been extremely busy over the past 2 weeks because of the war in the Gulf. So there was a strategic rationale there, and then by making this relatively modest $125 million investment, we basically signaled America's back, baby, and we gave alternatives to a government that was looking for ways to engage with the United States. I would also note China is not alone in this regard, and this whole issue really encapsulates Greece's strategic geography, its location at the meeting point between Africa, Europe, the Middle East. But there was also there's another port which came to be controlled by a Russian oligarch in Thessaloniki, northern Greece. They were engaged in some of the same efforts there, and then working in my case with UCOM to improve the capacity of third port at Alexander Gruber. I'm running out of batteries. Any big words. At Alexandroupoli, which has become a major transshipment port for the U.S. military. The government tried to privatize that port and couldn't find any buyers, so they actually retained it. And then, Alex, this connects to Ukraine, because Ukraine right now is in the midst of a tender for a major port on the Black Sea called Chernogorsk. And it is the first major privatization, public-private partnership in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. It comes in the context of what is going to be a dramatically remapped logistics and infrastructure map of the Black Sea region whenever the war comes to an end, because Ukraine will lose its access to ports in Crimea and on the Azov Sea. Russia is going to remain the dominant military actor bumping up against NATO in the Black Sea region. So we actually have a strong strategic interest in how this port privatization works out. I would love to draw more attention to it because, as far as I know, there are currently no American bidders on that facility. And it's entirely possible that if we don't pay attention, it'll be just like COSCO, where in Piraeus, where in a couple of years people are going to be asking, how did our adversary end up with this strategically located port in an important country? So I think, the sort of net on all of this, what I would highlight as the lesson learned is we need a mechanism to think strategically about these issues. And William talked a little bit about the color of money problem that we have in the U.S. government and the straitjacket that imposes on policymakers who are looking to shape interventions. In my case, the success in Piraeus happened because I made myself a complete and total annoyance to Adam Woolner, and he would tell you the same thing. And we got Adam to come to Greece, and I think what really opened his eyes was taking a tugboat, and I wanted to make sure that he saw Piraeus from the inside. So he arranged for a tugboat, which picked us all up on a pier very deep into the port. So he actually accessed the Alcina shipyard, coming past these enormous, fully loaded COSCO ships, and I think got a powerful impression of how deeply China had embedded itself into this strategic facility. I was very grateful for his support, but in fact, the transaction didn't culminate until the Biden administration, and it just reflects the nature of this. And maybe the last observation I will make, it's adjacent to the point I earlier made about China and critical minerals. The fundamental challenge that the United States faces on these issues is that we have a democracy. So we change governments every 4 or 8 years. There's change of control in Congress. China doesn't have that. So China's clearly, as this report lays out, been playing a long game, seeking to acquire strategically significant infrastructure at the lowest possible price, but in ways that is supportive of China's strategic objective of developing the capacity to be a peer rival of the United States and to achieve control over things like critical supply chains. We've got to figure out how we deal with this in the context of our democracy and how we build the long-term strategy which sends a message. That's why PGI was so important. That's why the investments that Exim is making into the critical mineral sector are so important. But I would not take any of this for granted. I think, in fact, there's not continued encouragement from Congress, from civil society, from the media, and from business in particular, to use our economic statecraft tools in a strategic way. We're not going to be successful in pushing back on China in this regard, in part because they're starting with such an enormous head start at this stage of the game.
Thank you. Maybe for the last question, we have agency. We can decide whether to vote support or not, and we have recommendations on how those countries might make a decision. Paul, you've written quite a bit about, within the context of Africa, how population policymakers don't necessarily want to get drawn into the great power competition, the geostrategic rivalries, etc. They don't necessarily want to see another foreign base hosted on their soil, etc. So tell us what you're sort of seeing in terms of current trends in this regard.
Yeah, Alex, look, that's a great question. Let me just use, because we've basically at the Africa Center, we've looked at 78 ports on the African continent that have a level of Chinese finance, Chinese shareholding, or Chinese engagement with refurbishing terminals and stuff like that. Let me look at Namibia, which is an excellent example. So Namibia has the port of Walvis Bay, which is one of the most advanced ports on the African continent, is an excellent example. What we saw in that particular case was the Chinese contractor, in this case the CHMC, coming in with a bundle, right? So it wasn't just the way that agreement was constructed involved other elements that the Namibian government requested, to be on the menu. One of those was the refurbishment of the Commandant General Staff College. The other were scholarships for Namibians, graduate scholarships, PhD scholarships, right? An increase in that. The other was more quotas for Namibian officers to train in Chinese military academies, including the peacekeeping school in Airu, just outside Beijing, right? There was a whole range of asks that the Namibian government put on the table, which CHDC, in order to get that contract, accepted. And accepted because this was basically low-hanging fruit, and at the same time it was something doable. Now, a lot of this stuff was provided as grants to be able to assist CHDC secure the larger contract. So in this case, there were items that the Chinese side put on the table for their Namibian counterparts. But that sends a very strong signal to the Namibian side that, hey, Namibia is in a strong position to put its own asks on the table. So when you look at the larger agreement, it contained many other things, some of which had absolutely nothing to do with the actual port. Some of it involved, for instance, equipment for exploring and mining, uranium. Namibia is a significant uranium producer. That involved, for instance, giving scholarships to Namibian engineers to go to the PRC, to study and to get skills in that particular enterprise. Absolutely nothing to do with the port. Namibian engineers going to work in Chinese shipyards, right? To learn different things. And, the cost of that was borne by the Chinese side. Some of it was the Chinese government, some of it was the state-owned enterprise, some of it was offered by the subsidiary, right? So I use Namibia as an example to show how African countries respond to the signals the Chinese side sends to be able to win these major contracts. There's no single contract that comes just as a contract to build a port. It comes with a whole range of things. So that speaks to agency on the African side. It provides policy space for African countries to basically put their asks on the table. If you study the asks that individual African countries put on the table when they go for the FOCAC, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, which occurs every 3 years, this is again another clear example of how these countries are putting these requests on the table. But I should also note that the entrenchment of Chinese engagement in these countries does not preclude them from seeking to work and build partnerships with other powers, right? With the exception of a few countries, African countries generally want to pursue what I call equidistance diplomacy, right? The opportunity to work to diversify partnerships in order to increase their room for maneuver, right? I see this as a positive signal for other countries like Japan, India, and others, the UK, Australia, to become involved in many of these areas. It is, I would say, in the DNA of African diplomacy to be able to want to swing between partners because that increases their leverage. This is by no means confined to the African side. I think African countries are borrowing a lot of examples from Asia, from Latin America, and the Caribbean. Because those countries negotiate with the Chinese in very, very similar ways. At least that's what the data is showing. And that's one of the reasons why at the Africa Center, we tend to look at China in Africa, but the vantage point is global China. Because to study and understand what the Chinese are doing in Africa, the picture is incomplete without a thorough analysis and examination of how the Chinese are operating in other parts of the world. Because, again, same instruments, same state-owned enterprises, sometimes even the same CEOs behind these enterprises that are basically learning lessons and applying lessons across different regions. So that's what I would say, using Namibia as an example in terms of how African countries, bless you, are trying to exercise agency in their dealings with Chinese partners.
Thank you, Paul. So I'd say that wraps up my questions for the panel. We'll now turn it over to the audience, and we have a couple of microphones that we can provide. And Ian here will be going to anybody who has a question with a mic. So questions? Great.
Hi, thank you for this really enlightening and informative presentation. I'm actually former USAID. I used to work on PGI. I'm now with an organization called Aid on the Hill, which advocates for the kind of positive economic statecraft that you were all discussing. One of the things that USAID was looking at was how to support US and Western consortiums to win tenders for strategic port infrastructure. And we were very involved in the Port of Manzanillo in the DR. And we partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers to work very proactively with the government there to ensure that the tender and the bid process is very fair, transparent, adhere to kind of international standards. And so when we're thinking about how to compete with the PRC in the port space for strategic ports, I'd like to hear about the extent to which you think that those kind of procurement or governance issues play a role in allowing the DFC to compete more effectively, and kind of how we can reimagine the U.S. national security toolkit going forward to better align our tools.
Maybe a couple of quick thoughts from my side. I want to hear from others, but first and foremost, nobody ever went to DFC for the fastest money. You go to DFC because it comes with an American flag. The U.S. ambassador shows up at the ribbon cutting, and people know, because the Americans care about the project, people know they can't screw around with it. And I think that goes to something Secretary Blinken always used to say it this way. He would always say, we have to make a better offer. And I would argue that these issues of governance and administrative transparency are part of that better offer. And certainly from a lot of experience that I had working in Africa, that was always part of the conversation with African leaders as well. And it's China's Achilles heel. This administration doesn't talk as much about those issues, and I think it's a mistake in terms of positioning the United States over the long term, because it clearly plays to the advantage of our companies, most of whom have shareholders and reports to regulatory overseers. And so they're fine with having that transparency and high standards, because that's written into their corporate DNA, and that's exactly what China cannot deliver.
Let me just say this, without speaking directly on policy matters. Let's look at what partners have done in this space and try and learn a thing or two. I love talking about Japan because it's one of the countries I cover. By the way, some of the best analysis on China comes out of Japan. So, just want to throw that out there. You look at the Nacala corridor, which is a very interesting logistics network between Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi, right? And the Japanese, this is one of the flagship Japanese projects that came out of the recent Japan-Africa Summit, the TICAC Summit, which took place last year, right? And this is a very interesting example of an effort to build a responsible, transparent mineral supply chain that advances Chinese strategic objectives, but also advances African strategic objectives in terms of value capture, right? It's a project that was negotiated among the four countries. But what the Japanese did is they basically looked at a pre-existing strategic plan. These three countries established the Nacala corridor years before the Japanese came in. And that corridor was established as a strategic objective of the African Union to build seamless regional connectivity among those countries. So when Japanese assistance came in, to the tune of $7.5 billion, the Japanese were basically plugging in to a system that's already existed, and there was ownership on the part of the three countries concerned. So at every point along the chain, you have quality, you have responsible governance, quality control, you have tracing, you have monitoring. The long-term objective is to build the capacity of these countries to be able to add value to their strategic minerals, right? For example, graphite in Mozambique, okay? But it also builds on strengthened diplomacy between the countries. So for instance, Mozambique leased some of its port space to Malawi, which is a landlocked country, to be able to facilitate that seamless trade. So I think, there are lessons to learn from what the Japanese and their African partners have been able to do with the Nacala corridor. It is also a burden sharing because, these days burden sharing has become a big thing. The Africa Development Bank put up some of the money. And the Japanese funds have been allocated through the Africa Development Bank. So that means they're sharing the burden and they're sharing the risk. And there's training and all that. The final thing that I would say is that the Nacala corridor is not simply an initiative to extract and export raw materials, because that has been the old model in Africa, which hasn't worked. What it is an initiative that is aimed at working with African countries to gain some value. That's number one. Number two, it allows the participating countries to develop their agricultural zones to be able to export agricultural equipment as well, agricultural produce, in addition to minerals. So what I would call it is an experiment in more efficient exports, not just for critical minerals, but for other products that have absolutely nothing to do with critical minerals, right? So I think there are lessons to learn in how the Japanese have been able to develop this project with their African partners, which includes private sector, civil society oversight, and it also includes the governance piece, which the 3 African countries have accepted in this particular case. I think there are lessons to learn.
William, do you want to answer that?
No.
I don't know if Paul knew ahead of time, but there is an NHJ film crew here from Japan, so your answer will be received, I'm sure. Any question?
I had a question for Paul. You mentioned that there was a concentration of Chinese ports in West Africa, which surprised me because I would have expected it to be East Africa. Is there a particular reason why West Africa is attracting more of this investment, and does that have specific geopolitical implications, or is it just by coincidence?
Thank you. It surprised us too. We put up this report on Chinese engagements in African ports, and we found they're concentrated in the West Africa region. But I think 3 things. I think first, simply the commercial opportunities, right? West Africa has tended to be more stable than many of these other regions of Africa, and so there's an opportunity for Chinese state-owned enterprises to make money, right? So I think there's a commercial dimension to it. At the same time, there's a security dimension in the sense that the Chinese, the Chinese Navy has deployed 48 task forces since 2008, right? They patrol African waters and so on. They've mainly been confined to, or rather they've confined themselves to the Western Indian Ocean, right? But over the past 3, 4, 5 years, they've been showing an interest and greater appetite to cover the Gulf of Guinea, right? Which sits in West Africa, and to build those relationships with West African countries. So there's a security element involved. I think there's a strategic element as well, because when one looks at the speed or the pace at which African countries signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, the highest, per capita came from the West Africa region. I think on the Chinese side, to some extent, there's a sense that a lot of sort of Chinese really respected the fact, for instance, that the French were very entrenched in West Africa, so they were very careful in terms of what they did. The Chinese also have that sense of self-restraint. But I think we've seen that disappear. The French have come under a lot of pressure in the West Africa region. So we've seen that the Chinese becoming much more bolder, much more willing to use their West Africa engagements strategically. I think it makes sense from a Chinese perspective for a number of reasons, but at the same time it also gives them that experience, right? So one of the very interesting things with the West Africa region is you're tending to find more and more Chinese ambassadors and Chinese diplomats who are completely fluent in French, for instance. This was not the case even 10 years ago. So clearly, there's a story there. But it by no means suggests that the Chinese have not had problems. So they've had problems, for instance, in Niger, right, with the pipeline in Niger, which is now ruled by a military government, and there've been a lot of problems in terms of negotiating with this government on the part of the Chinese. They kicked out some oil executives, and they demanded the renegotiation, right, of some of the Chinese investments in the country. So it's burning fingers, but to use a Chinese proverb, it's basically feeding the stones as they move along. But certainly West Africa is really on the front burner of a number of these Chinese initiatives. So that's how I would describe it.
Our last one or two questions, maybe.
Hello, I'm Isha Keroja, an attorney with the U.S. Department of Commerce, and we work on kind of reforming the regulatory and legal landscapes of countries, specifically in Asia, to kind of accelerate U.S. investments and protect them, specifically in port infrastructure. But one thing we're seeing, similar to as the ambassador stated, that even where we reform the legal landscapes and we kind of ensure that there's fair, transparent processes, there's not a lot of U.S. company interest in bidding in these tenders. So obviously we rely on that heavily because the U.S. just doesn't have the same financing capabilities as the Chinese state-owned banks. Do you have any suggestions of how to kind of drum up that interest, that very necessary interest from U.S. companies to kind of invest in critical infrastructure abroad?
I could take the first stab at that. I think that's a good point about I think we talk a lot about the importance of the U.S. offer versus the offer made for partnership through a PRC, state-owned or state-owned entity. I think ultimately, though, there is a point at which competition becomes financial, and the ability of the Chinese state to underwrite these types of investments and to compete on the basis of price does matter and has an impact on capital flows around the world. And for the U.S., we struggle to identify mechanisms which we can move the threshold for profitability for the decision to invest or not invest on a particular capital expenditure for a U.S. company or a U.S. fund or whatever it might be in the same way. And there are lots of instances. This was the original impetus for creating the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which became ESC, which most people are familiar with here. But ultimately, even when we apply our tools to SafeCraft, they're often limited by the nature of appropriations law or the rules by which the program is defined, and the PRC state-aligned entities that are in moments of direct competition aren't necessarily constrained by the same vehicles, or the same statutory authorities or FICRA or whatever OMB said to you about that particular program. They just move 1 percentage point lower in terms of the way to subsidize the cost of capital. So that's my take on it, but I don't know if others want to come in.
The other point I would say, and thinking about some of the Asian markets in particular, we have to, again, pick our battles, but also recognize that you don't have to have full vertically integrated control to have a significant influence to put an American flag on these projects. So it's also, I would also say, find the U.S. vendors, the U.S. companies that you can work with that will at least ensure that you don't have a Costco Piraeus type situation where China controls the ships, the cranes, the pierside equipment. Get American companies into the picture, and then that helps to grow the possibility there. I think it's a much harder lift, especially in this sector where we don't have national champions, to sort of create a U.S. company. And I say this in part with my Alexandropoli experience in mind, because in that case, you had some American companies that came forward. They were mainly interested because they saw Henagan contracts, but they didn't have the record of experience, which gave the government confidence that a private American company could do a better job than the state enterprise that was running forward at the time.
Let me just say one thing. I think, in the scholarship space, I think we need to invest in studies to ask the question, what happened, right? How many shipyards do we have in this country? Right? The Chinese have 300 shipyards. How many ships do we produce a year in the United States? The Chinese are rolling out over 1,000 ships a year, right? Liberia is a country that, there's no country that is more friendly to the United States, arguably on the African continent and Oceania, than Liberia. Because, two countries share a very, very peculiar history, right? One of my very good colleagues is a former Liberian Minister of Works. And under the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration, he was given responsibility for handling China investments, right? In the 80s and the 90s, and this, you can look at this across African countries, right? Every time the government put out a tender for ports, roads, the first 8 companies would be American. Pan Am built Liberia's international airport. Okay? Fast forward to the 2000s. Every time Liberia put out a tender, right, for a port, or whatever, construction, the first 8 companies are Chinese, and they're all competing ruthlessly against each other. Some of them are municipal-owned companies, some of them are central state-owned companies, some are owned by provinces, some are owned by the Chinese Communist Party. They compete against each other, literally like sharks. There are no American or Western companies to be seen, right? So I think we need to figure out what happened in the United States for the United States to have seeded this commercial engagement. I was talking to somebody from the Kenyan Ministry of Finance who said something very, very similar. Where are the Americans? Okay, who were known for innovation, known for quality, all that. Where are they? It's the Chinese that are competing. So that's, I think, the first element. The second element is, I think, has a lot to do with perception of risk. Now, that is not to say that it's not true that the Chinese are not risk averse. The Chinese are very risk averse, which is why they don't like to invest in greenfield. They're also risk averse. But I think a lot of what needs to be done with the American industry to address this risk averseness that seems to be preventing American firms from investing, not just on the African continent, but also places like South Asia, places like Pakistan. We can talk about the port of Guadalajara, for instance. So I think these would be the two things that I would say. We need to figure out what happened, and then to put in place policies to address that. And I think this is probably one thing that scholarship might be able to do.
I think we're slowly running out of time, but I just wanted to add a thought here that we also need to look beyond just commitment, the bidding, and tender process. And I think talking about risk, I think this pretty place in well that although this is not in our data set, I actually had the pleasure of traveling to Georgia about 2-3 years ago, where there was previously an American consortium that was supposed to construct the port of Nantulya on the Black Sea, but that unfortunately ended up falling through. The consortium ended up falling through, and there was a Chinese consortium instead that was going through the tender process. And I think they ultimately, it still is delayed, I believe, at this point. And then similarly, the DFC actually announced a commitment of a $553 million loan and was it November 2023 for the Port of Colombo, a new terminal that they were going to build together with the Adani Group, but that unfortunately ultimately ended up falling through too. So I think there's also, we need to ask ourselves, how can we first of all drum up interest, both public-private partnerships from American and other partner countries, but also how can we make sure that we move beyond commitment to implementation and ultimately successful completion.
Thanks, Leah. And I think we'll wrap it there. And big thanks to all our panelists for appearing and our audience members. And please help yourself to the snacks center. Thank you.